So I'm over at my ironing area and I've unboxed my fabric. So I've got the full width of the fabric by 80 centimetres for this project. Now, the first thing to do with this cable knit, if I show you at the selvages, you've got this sort of funny band here that looks slightly different. And then following the funny band is a small cable. So on this pattern, it goes small cable, big cable, small, small, big, small, small, big, small, small. And at the selvage, you've got this funny bit and then you've got a small cable. And what we want to do is just trim off the selvage so that the edge of the fabric is at the beginning of that small cable. Because when we fold over the ends in a minute, we're going to fold it over by the width of the small cable. That gives us a really neat look on the inside. It keeps our seam dead straight and it naturally wants to fold there anyway. The other thing is that the selvage, this sort of funny bit here, it can be sort of further away from that cable in some places than in others. And so just by trimming that down, you get a nice accurate panel. So that's the first thing to do. So make sure I'm only cutting, what I want to cut. And I'm just going to cut it to the beginning of that small cable. So hopefully you can see, excuse the shadows there. So I'm just going to cut to here, to the beginning of that small cable. So I've just thought of something whilst I'm doing that. If you're wearing this in cape mode, it'd be quite nice, wouldn't it, to have where the poppers are in the centre front. It'd be quite nice if these bits, sort of generally speaking, kind of lined up, wouldn't it? So in fact, I'm looking at these two selvages here. I've just folded the fabric round. On this selvage, you've got one cable, big, small, small, big. On this one, you've got two. So what I'm actually going to do is, it doesn't matter if it's slightly shorter, is I'm actually going to cut here. Because then I'm going to cut here on this side, and then when I'm wearing it with this down the centre front, these cables are going to match up really nicely. So in fact, I'm going to cut slightly more off of that side. It probably won't end up being slightly more because that's got a deeper selvagey bit. So I'm going to actually cut here and here, and that will give me, once it's folded in half, it will give me a nice symmetrical look. So I hope that makes sense. Give me a shout if you've got any questions about that. It's just so that it's, it doesn't really matter, but it's just, I think that will look nicer if I ever wear it with the snappers at the front. So I'm cutting to the edge of the second cable here, just so that it's perfectly symmetrical. So on each selvage will start by a small cable. Each edge of the panel will start with a small cable followed by a large cable, and then the pattern will continue. So just end up with a tiny bit of wastage there, but I'm going to end up with a nice symmetrical even panel to sew with. Don't worry if you're cutting off more at the top than you did at the bottom. And what you'll end up with is that you just cut to the edge of that small cable, and then on the other side repeat the same. And this will give you a nice symmetrical poncho. Make sure that you haven't accidentally folded anything under there, and you're not cutting through your ironing board or any other piece of fabric that might be laying around. There we are. I like that noise. So satisfying. Okay, all the way to the end I go. Right, so we've trimmed down those selvages on the two shorter sides, and so you'll end up with a small cable at the beginning of each, and they match up side to side like that. So if you wear it folded down the front, not that anyone's going to notice, but in the name of being perfectionist, we've just trimmed that down. Now, next thing we're going to do is we're going to concentrate on the longer side, and I'm just going to start by looking, because what we're going to do in a minute is we're going to turn this to the wrong side and we're going to press it over by 1 centimetre and we're going to sew it down. But before I do that, what I like to do is I like to just look along this edge, and any little fluffy bits I just trim off. So any little stray bits of fluff, I just give it a little trim and a little neaten. It's just from the washing it and what have you, you might have a few fluffy bits. Generally it doesn't fray, and your zigzag stitch that you're going to do in a minute will make sure that it's all secure. But by trimming down any little fluffy bits, it will just give you a really nice neat look, because you're probably going to when you're wearing it, the asymmetric nature, which means that you're going to see flashes of the inside of the garment when it's worn. So by just neatening things up, making things as neat as you possibly can before you start, then you're going to have a result that you're really happy with. I'm not cutting any of the fabric, I'm just anywhere that fluffy has gotten in the way. There we go, that's all down that one side. I'll sweep up the floor later, we'll worry about that another time. Okay, so then what we're going to do is all the way down the length of that long seam. This is where you're going to need your ruler. So all the way down that long side, I'm now going to press over by 1.5 centimetres. I'll just measure as I go. And then it wants to bounce back because it's bouncy fabric, but I will just, at intervals, I'll just use a wonder clip to hold it down. There we are, so I've now come along all the way along that long edge. It doesn't matter which one, doesn't matter which one you do first. You just want to go all the way along one of the long edges, and you're going to press it in by 1.5 centimetres all the way down. And we're going to go back over to our sewing machine now, and we're going to zigzag that seam. So I'm back over at my machine. I'm going to put my work underneath my presser foot and just lower that down onto the fabric. Now what I want is I want the raw edge to be somewhere in the middle of that window there. So if I just hand wind my needle, each time my machine makes a zigzag, I want it to hug the raw edge. So I want this line of stitching to do two jobs. I want it to encase this raw edge at the same time as stitching the fold back. So I'll do a couple of back stitches to secure, and then off I go. Now I'm just keeping an eye on this fold here, should be roughly around the 15 line, 15 millimetres or 1.5 centimetres, 5/8 of an inch, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. Now can you see how when that needle is to the left, it's just piercing this side, and then when it's coming over to the right, it's coming onto this side, so it's piercing the fabric to the left hand side of the fold of the raw edge, and then it's coming back here. And what that's doing is it's giving me a really nice finish, and the stitches are really sinking in to this lovely soft lofty cable knit fabric, and I'll end up with something that looks really, really neat on the inside. And again, you want to just take your time with this. If the fabric starts to run away with you, just lift, making sure that your needle's in the fabric, just lift your foot, take your time, make sure everything's in its place, and then start going again. Every time you can see the fabric rolling away from where you want it to be, just stop and pause and just make sure everything's nice where you want it to be, and then start again. You're doing a really long seam here. It's like 1.5 meter long seam. So, you know, if you get into the realms of the fabric walking away from you, then if you don't stop and correct it, by the time you get to the end of the seam, you'll be all over the shop. Now, I'm not going to make you watch me do this entire thing because it would be incredibly boring, although it might be quite mesmerising and relaxing at the same time, but nonetheless I'm going to trudge on and then I'll show you when it's finished. So that's how the seam should look. On one side you have that zigzag, and on the other side same zigzag, but it should just encase that raw edge at the same time as sewing it down. If you've come off the edge a little bit, don't worry too much, and you can always trim it if you're very careful. But it's quite a satisfyingly neat finish and surprisingly easy to achieve on this fabric. This fabric is extremely well behaved. It does exactly as you tell it to, and not like a single jersey. It doesn't roll up, you know, like the single jerseys do. So it's quite nice to work with. Quite enjoying this. There we go. So then what we're going to do, we've done that long side, take yourself over to the other side, the opposite long side, and you're going to repeat those exact same processes again on the other side, so that both of the long edges are folded, pressed and stitched back. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll come back and show you how we tackle the ends. So I've done exactly the same on the other side, and you'll notice looking at this that it's just stretched the fabric a little bit as it goes through the machine, which is perfectly okay and normal. And just to get that to shrink back to a nice flat seam, you can just use a little bit of steam on your iron. So just give it a good steamy press. And that will just shrink it back and flatten it all back out again. So that just eliminates any of that wobbling. And so I'm going to give that a press now. So we've done those two longer edges. We're now going to do the shorter edges. And this is where it gets a bit repetitive. It's exactly the same again. The only difference is that with this one we've got the cable. Remember, we cut just to the edge of that small cable as a guide for pressing. So all I shall do is I'll press back by the width of that one cable. So on the inside of my garment it will look nice and neat because the seam allowance on the inside will just look like one individual cable lying to the inside of the garment, which is nice and neat, and gives me a nice straight edge there. So I give it a press and pop a couple of wonder clips. There they are, over on the other side. At the corners, don't do anything fancy at all. I just fold it back and fold it back. I found that to be the neatest solution. If you do anything fancy, like mitered corners, this fabric is a bit bouncy and a bit wodgy, and you just end up with something less than elegant. So sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution. Here we go. So I'm just going to go all the way to the end. This is a much shorter seam. Remember, this is only 80 centimetres, whereas the other one was the whole width of the fabric of 150. There we go. Can you see how nice that looks? Because it's just that cable. If we'd have tried to press that over when it was the selvagey bit, it probably wouldn't have happened so nicely. There we go. So I've clipped that in place. Use pins if you haven't got wonder clips, and then I'm just going to do exactly the same and zigzag all the way along there. I can see a little bit there where it's not quite even. Take the opportunity to trim that down. Why not? Just perfect as you go. There we are, that's better. So I'm just going to sew all the way along there, and then I'm going to do the same on the other side. So what I'll end up with is a rectangle with all 4 edges folded in and secured with a zigzag stitch.